But boy, it sure is disappointing that the Trump administration has promised to get rid of the Department of Education, at least as a campaign promise. And now it sounds like the latest scheme is to merge the Department of Education with the Department of Labor. Talk about that, Alex.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the plan. And instead of abolishing the education department, which is, of course, unconstitutional, they want to merge it as a pretext for shrinking it, supposedly, with the other unconstitutional department, the labor department. And the thinking is that the fusion of these two will help create a better workforce, right? A more seamless integration from government indoctrination, education, straight into, serfdom, work life. And so that's the thinking anyways, at least that's what we're being told. And supposedly this is a plan of former Congressman and current Office of Management and Budget Director Mick Mulvaney, who, from everything I know about him, he's a pretty decent guy. And so, I have no reason to suspect his motives. But, I think what they're probably thinking is, the Congress is not going to let us get away with just outright abolishing the department, so maybe we'll merge them. And so that's the big concern here, that, while this is being portrayed as a way to shrink the government and reduce the size and scope of government, it does further something on the agenda of the globalists that we've known about for many, many years.
Yeah, it doesn't shrink anything. I don't know how you make the argument that by taking two bloated bureaucracies in Washington, D.C., melding them together and pretending one of them is going to get smaller, and just think about how progressives would be outraged, justifiably so, if we merge the Department of Education, say, with the military, right, the Pentagon, right, feeding the military-industrial complex. They'd lose their ever-loving mind. And I think conservatives are exactly right to protest this. They are. This idea that somehow already there's way too much Republican participation in this school-to-work BS nonsense, this argument that practical education has to replace education for enrichment and morality and cultural knowledge and personal enrichment, this idea that somehow education has to become as utilitarian as everything else in this society is exactly the problem with things like Common Core. And tell me what you think about this, but we knew when we were getting Betsy DeVos that we were not going to get somebody that was opposed to Common Core, number one. The Department of Education just hired another former Jeb Bush assistant to run a key office there in the Department of Education. So this idea that Common Core, you don't have somebody with Betsy DeVos who's going to oppose Common Core, get rid of Common Core. She's even arguing that Common Core doesn't exist anymore. So we knew that we weren't going to win that battle. But this is a pretty parallel. Where do you think these ideas are coming from? What is, in your mind, the backdrop for this, the ultimate goal?
Well, you're absolutely right to talk about Betsy DeVos. She comes from this kind of cabal, this little clique of education people who believe in centralization of the education system. She was on the board of Jeb Bush's organization. Jeb Bush has, of course, been one of the leading proponents, cheerleaders of Common Core. You're right, one of his deputies, his lieutenant governor, was just hired to run the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the Department of Education. So this is all really problematic. As for the real goal of this, I think it's to finalize the transition from real, legitimate education to indoctrination and workforce training. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing here. And I think it begins, as many of our friends have pointed out to, it begins with a fundamental misunderstanding of education. If you go back to the earliest education in America, the earliest government involvement in education, we can go back to the 1640s in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's when we had the first education laws passed in the United States. And this was really, the fruit of the Reformation. They came out and they said, hey, everybody needs to know the Bible, therefore everybody needs to know how to read. Therefore, if you live in a town that's big enough and there are people there who don't read, you guys ought to get together and put up a building and hire a teacher and make sure that everybody's learning to read. And the purpose, actually, they named this act the Old Deluder Satan Act. And they say right in the law that everybody needs to know Scripture, because if they don't, Satan will mislead them, and therefore they will lose their liberties and their souls and all the rest of it. Their eternal salvation might not come about, and so they can't be duped. So that was always, throughout American history, the understanding of education is that it needed to be Christian, Bible-centered, and it needed to be functional. People should learn how to read and how to write and how to educate themselves and how to think and how to use rhetoric and how to use logic and how to understand the world around them. We've moved completely away from that model to the point where now education really is, and this was kind of the idea of John Dewey, an indoctrination system to churn out good little socialist workers who will participate willingly and voluntarily in the global socialist utopia that they want to build. And so we're kind of getting close to the end game here, and this is just one more troubling giant step in that direction, it seems to me.
Well, Lynn Taylor, among others, has got a great petition up at the on her site trying to get people to sign the petition, to petition the Department of Education not to do that. Bottom line, you and I understand this. Tinkering with the Department of Education, messing with appointments, and trying to tinker with at the edges of Common Core, none of this is going to change the simple reality that you got to get your kids out of the schools. There's nothing the federal government can do. All the federal government could do is get rid of the Department of Education. That would not, in and of itself, fix most of our problems. It would be a stepping point to fixing our problems at the state and local level, but it wouldn't fix the problem. They're not going to do it anyway. And I posit this. If they were to join the Department of Education to the Department of Labor or any other bureaucracy, it would become much harder to get rid of it than it is now, and it's almost impossible now to do it.
Telling parents that this stuff can be reformed is really giving them a false hope. You're talking about, sending your children into a burning building and saying, well, the firemen are going to put it out, so I'll just leave them in there, while the firemen put it out. That's not going to happen right now. We are so far down this road for people to hold out hope that we're going to be able to reform this and that they're going to be able to keep their kids in there and somehow they're going to stop sexualizing them and brainwashing them and teaching them how to read using quackery that we know causes illiteracy. I mean, that's futile, and we should stop giving people false hopes. The schools are corrupt. The government schools are totally corrupt. They are not reformable, well, at least not within our lifetime. And so parents, you have to do the right thing and protect your children from this. And nobody should be under the false illusion that with enough tinkering, everything is going to get better. It's, the situation is dire, it is urgent, and parents need to take action.